It's 3 a.m. and you're still awake. The room is dark, but your mind isn't. You're staring at the ceiling, phone glowing somewhere near your pillow, replaying a conversation from 6 hours ago, a bill you haven't paid, an email you haven't answered. Tomorrow starts in 5 hours. You know this. Your body knows this. And still, sleep won't come. If you've felt this before, you're not alone. Somewhere between 10 and 30 out of every 100 people in rich modern countries deal with ongoing sleep trouble. It's so common that we barely question it. We just accept that modern life comes at a cost: restless nights, a busy mind, and mornings that never feel like enough. But here's the strange part. Go back before farming, before cities, before clocks and screens and rent, and that number doesn't just get smaller, it almost disappears. Among some of the last groups on Earth who still live by hunting and gathering, only about 1 or 2 out of every 100 people struggle with sleep this way. Same kind of human, same brain, same body. And yet one way of life fills the night with worry, which raises a strange question. What if it isn't just sleep? What if, in many parts of life, fairness, community, health, even how we treat the sick and the weak, the real story runs the opposite way from what we've been taught? To understand what really changed, we need to step back much further than you'd expect. Humans like us have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Farming, growing crops, keeping animals living in one place, only shows up around 10 to 12,000 years ago. Cities, writing, kings, and armies come later still. Do the math, and something surprising shows up. For more than 95 out of every 100 years our species has existed, there were no farms, no cities, no rulers. There were only small, moving groups of people, walking across Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Australia, hunting, gathering food, and raising children together. That means the human body, your mind, were not built for office chairs, supermarkets, or 8-hour workdays. They were shaped over hundreds of thousands of years for something very different. And that different way of life left clues in bones, in old graves, in layers of ash, in the DNA of ancient skeletons that scientists are only now learning to read. So here's the question this film wants to sit with. We've long believed that history moves in a straight line, that we walked out of the caves, invented writing, built cities, and simply got better, smarter, kinder, more civilized. But what if that's only half the story? What if, while gaining huge power over nature, we also lost something, a way of living that was, in some very clear and measurable ways, more fair, more caring, and easier on the earth than the one most of us live in today? To answer that, we first need a new way of understanding one word: civilized. The most equal societies in history weren't big nations. They were small groups of about 50 people. For most of the last century, scientists measured civilization using a simple checklist. It came from an Australian scientist named V. Gordon Childe, and it included things like cities, writing, a central government, and social classes. If a group didn't have these things, it was called primitive. But here's what's interesting. If you swap that checklist for a different question, how fairly did people share what they had? The ranking flips upside down. Scientists studying old economies, including Timothy Kohler and Samuel Bowles, used a tool called the Gini score to measure how unequal wealth was across many old and new societies. A score of 0 means everyone has the same amount. A score close to 1 means almost everything belongs to almost nobody. Hunter-gatherer groups before farming had an average Gini score of about 0.17, very close to equal. Compare that to today. Germany sits at 0.73. The United States sits at 0.81, closer to the unfairness of an old Egyptian farming town than to its own ancient ancestors. How did small hunting groups manage this? Not with laws, but with something scientists call strong equality. If someone tried to hoard food, boss others around, or act like a boss, the group pushed back through gossip, teasing, public shame, even being kicked out. Leaders did exist, but only for a moment. Whoever was best at tracking led that day's hunt, and led nothing the next day. Power was never allowed to stick around. But here's a part almost nobody talks about. This wasn't simple or naive. In their book, The Dawn of Everything, thinkers David Graeber and David Wengrow argue that ancient people played with different ways of organizing power on purpose. Some groups switched season by season between strict rules during big group hunts and total freedom once they split apart again. They tried on power like a costume, then took it off before it could become permanent. And they didn't need permanent rulers to build something huge. In northeastern Louisiana, around 3,000 years ago, a moving group of hunter-gatherers with no farms yet built Poverty Point, a giant complex of earth mounds. One part, called Mound A, holds almost 10 million cubic feet of soil, moved entirely by hand in less than 3 months. No wheels, no farm animals to help, no king ordering an army of workers. Just baskets, backs, and a shared goal. 900 years before that, at a place now called Watson Brake, another moving group of hunter-gatherers built 11 mounds joined together in a giant oval shape older than the pyramids of Egypt and older than Stonehenge. Here's the twist. We've long assumed that big monuments need kings to build them. Ancient North America proves that's not true. People didn't need someone forcing them to work together. Teamwork alone could build something amazing. Ancient humans took care of the sick and disabled more steadily than we often do today. Picture a group of Neanderthals, 45,000 years ago, in the mountains of what is now Iraq. One man, call him Shanidar, one was hit hard on the head as a young man. The blow blinded one eye, damaged the part of his brain that controls movement, left one arm weak and useless, and crippled one leg. He couldn't hunt. He could barely walk. He still lived to somewhere between 35 and 45 years old, a long life for a Neanderthal. That's only possible one way. For years and years, the people around him fed him, protected him, and kept him alive, long after he could no longer help the group survive on his own. Scientists call this study the care of the past. Reading old bones not to see how people died, but to see how they were kept alive against the odds. And Shanidar one is far from the only case. In Calabria, Italy, 12,000 years ago, a young woman we now call Romito II was buried next to an older female relative. Testing her DNA showed she had a rare condition that caused very short height and limbs that couldn't move freely. She lived into her late teens in a group that walked long distances across steep mountains. Someone carried her. Someone slowed down for her. Someone prepared her food. Go back even further 500,000 years to a cave system in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, and you find the skull of a child we now call Benjamina. The bones of her skull had fused together too early before she was even born, which likely gave her a visibly different shaped head and probably slowed her growth. She lived to at least 10 or 12 years old. This wasn't even our own species, it was an earlier kind of human called Homo heidelbergensis, and even they chose, generation after generation, to keep a child alive who couldn't fully care for herself. And in a Florida wetland 8,000 years ago, a 15-year-old boy with a spine problem, unable to use his legs, missing a foot from an old, fully healed injury, was cared for and carried by his group until he died naturally. But here's where it gets surprising. None of this happened by chance, or because a few kind people existed. Scientist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy argues this kind of care was built into the whole system, built into how humans raised children from the start. Unlike chimpanzees whose mothers guard their babies alone and don't trust others near them, human babies were raised by what Hrdy calls helper parents, grandmothers, aunts, older brothers and sisters, and people who weren't even related, all sharing the work of raising a child. That kind of system needed something big, trusting people who weren't your closest family with your child. And that trust, repeated generation after generation, may be exactly what shaped the kindness, the mind-reading skill, and the emotional understanding that make humans who we are long before we even had big brains or full language to explain it. Which brings up an uncomfortable question. Modern families, often alone in apartments in suburbs, frequently don't have that wide circle of caretakers at all. We built better hospitals, but did we build weaker communities? Ancient people were neither peaceful angels nor savage killers. In 2011, thinker Steven Pinker wrote a popular book arguing that ancient life was full of violence. Up to 14 or 15 out of every 100 deaths, he said, came from war and murder. His point? It was modern government with its police and courts that calmed down our violent nature. It's a neat story. But here's what's interesting. Other scientists went back and checked Pinker's own numbers and found the real picture was much messier than he made it sound. Researchers Douglas Fry and R. Brian Ferguson said Pinker mixed together very different kinds of groups, including settled farming-like villages that lived nothing like true wandering hunter-gatherers. When Fry looked only at truly wandering groups, the kind that make up most of human history, organized war turned out to be rare or missing in most of the cultures studied. Fighting, when it did happen, was usually solved by walking away, avoiding each other, or a fight between just two people, not full battles. But that doesn't mean ancient life was peaceful either. The bones tell their own story, and it isn't gentle. At a rock shelter in northern Spain called San Juan ante Portam Latinum, scientists studied the remains of 338 people from around 5,000 years ago. Almost 1 in 4 showed signs of violent injury. About 1 in 10 had died from wounds that never healed, arrowhead damage matching high-speed hits, meaning organized fighting from a distance. Almost all of the deadly wounds were on young men and adult men. In Sudan, at a site called Jebel Sahaba, dating back 12,000 years, 40 out of every 100 skeletons show arrowheads or spear tips still stuck in the bone. So, which is true, peaceful, or violent? The honest answer is neither one, fully. Fighting between individuals and small raids show up throughout ancient history, but large, organized, ongoing war armies, planned attacks, fighting over land seems to grow much bigger only after people settled down, started farming, and began building up private wealth worth fighting over. In places like coastal Chile, killings jumped sharply right when farming arrived, and people began competing hard for land. Here's a thought worth sitting with. It wasn't civilization that invented violence. What civilization changed was the size of it from a fight between two men to a war between whole nations. Ancient humans didn't just survive nature, they shaped it. For a long time, a popular idea said that when the first humans reached the Americas and Australia, they wiped out the land like an unstoppable force, hunting mammoths, giant sloths, and dozens of other huge Ice Age animals into extinction almost overnight. It's called the overkill idea, and it paints ancient humans as careless hunters who didn't think ahead. It's a dramatic story. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Most scientists today don't fully believe it. Studies show that most experts blame these extinctions on a mix of causes, with fast climate change at the end of the Ice Age doing most of the damage, and human hunting adding extra pressure in some places. Out of 76 major ancient hunting sites in North America, only 14 show clear proof that humans actually hunted mammoths or mastodons there. Most ancient meals were built around small animals and wild plants, not giant prey. But the far more interesting story isn't what ancient humans destroyed. It's what they carefully built. Across Australia, Europe, and North America, ancient hunter-gatherers didn't just react to nature, they shaped it, using fire as a tool. Scientists call this cultural burning. Small, controlled, well-timed fires that cleared away dead plants before they could fuel a huge wildfire, opened up patches of grass that drew in animals to hunt, and helped grow the exact berries and healing plants people needed. In the fire-prone pine forests of northern New Mexico, the ancestors of the Jemez people lived for over 500 years using exactly this method, cutting wood for fuel and lighting small, scattered fires that kept the forest open and stopped dead plant matter from piling up. Scientists studying tree rings alongside computer models found that this human-managed land protected the area from huge, out-of-control wildfires for hundreds of years. Here's the twist that modern fire agencies are only now catching up to. For 100 years, modern countries stopped every fire they could, thinking that was protection. It wasn't. It just delayed the problem, letting dead plant matter pile up until fires finally came back bigger and more destructive than ever. Ancient humans with no satellites or fire trucks understood something about living with fire instead of only fighting it that we are only now learning again. Your body is still living in the Ice Age. Here's an experiment nobody signed up for, but every one of us is part of. Take a body shaped by 300,000 years of evolution and place it inside bright offices, processed food, and a schedule set by an alarm clock instead of the sun. Then watch what happens. Scientists studying groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, the Tsimane of Bolivia, and the San of Namibia, some of the last people living close to a traditional hunting and gathering life, found something striking: heart disease, type 2 diabetes. And being overweight, the health problems that quietly harm huge numbers of people in wealthy countries are almost completely missing among them. Scientists call this the mismatch idea. The idea that our bodies and minds evolved for one kind of life, but are now living inside a very different one. And the gap between the two is where a lot of modern sickness comes from. You can see it in movement. Using small tracking devices, scientists found that the Hadza move at a moderate to hard level for about 173 minutes every single day, far more than the 150 minutes per week that modern health experts recommend. Interestingly, the Hadza also rest for over 11 hours a day, but even their resting looks different: squatting, kneeling, staying in positions that keep muscles gently working, instead of sitting collapsed in a chair for hours like people often do today, and you can see it at night. Sleep scientists Gandhi Yetish and Jerome Siegel studied the Hadza, San, and Tsimane, and found something that goes against the popular idea of needing 8 hours of sleep. These groups sleep only about 5.7 to 7.1 hours a night on average, but their sleep is closely tied to their surroundings falling asleep as the temperature drops after sunset, and waking up naturally near dawn, at the coldest part of the night. And just like we said at the start of this film, ongoing sleep trouble in these groups sits at about 1 or 2 out of every 100 people, compared to 10 to 30 out of every 100 in rich, modern countries. Add to this the mental side. Our ancient stress response was built for short bursts, spot danger, react, then calm down. Modern life instead gives us a slow, steady drip of low-level stress money worries, phone notifications, competition that keeps the body's alarm system switched on for years at a time, wearing down both the immune system and the mind. And where ancient life kept people surrounded by close family and friends at all times, modern life often leaves people alone in small, separate homes, a shift some scientists link directly to rising loneliness and low mood. Here's the hard truth: we didn't outgrow our Ice Age bodies. We just built a world that no longer fits them. Some of the smartest people in history never wrote a single word, but modern life's real win was never really about being smarter. There's a quiet, wrong idea hiding inside the word primitive, that people without writing must have been simple thinkers. The evidence from old sites says the opposite, in amazing detail. Take something as basic looking as a stone tool. Making a working cutting piece from a raw rock takes a deep, gut-level understanding of how stone breaks, knowing, strike by strike, how force will travel through a shape that has never existed before, planning several hits ahead while adjusting for a surface that keeps changing under your hands. But here's where it gets surprising. Neanderthals went far beyond simple stone cutting. They made birch bark tar, the world's first man-made glue, using a careful, low-oxygen heating process that had to be kept at just the right temperature, in several careful steps. Get it wrong, and there's no glue at all. At a cave in South Africa called Sibudu, early humans mixed red clay with plant gum to make a stronger glue, and the clay wasn't just for color, it actually changed the chemistry of the gum, changing how it hardened. That's real chemistry, 60,000 years before the word chemistry even existed. And at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, humans were carefully heating stone in controlled fires 164,000 years ago, changing its inner structure on purpose to make sharper tools. Beyond tools, ancient hunter-gatherers carried something even more amazing in their heads: a huge memorized knowledge of hundreds of plant types, animal migration paths, and water sources spread across giant areas of land, naming systems for local plants and animals that studies show often have more detail than the ones used by trained modern scientists. This wasn't superstition, it was life or death knowledge, passed down by word of mouth, without a single written page. And they weren't cut off from each other either. In India, seashell beads found more than 350 miles from the nearest coast, dating back 25,000 years, are solid proof of long-distance trading. Real connection and exchange stretching across land most of us would call untouched wilderness. So after 5 chapters of turned-around ideas, does that mean ancient life was simply better? Here's where the story needs honesty, not a fairy tale. Modern life achieved something ancient life never could. It took baby deaths from nearly 27 out of every 100 down to under 3. It took child deaths from about 49 out of every 100 down to under 4. It nearly tripled how long people live on average from about 30 years to over 74. Antibiotics, vaccines, clean surgery, none of this existed for our ancestors, and infections, not long-term illness, were the main cause of death throughout most of human history. Modern legal systems, even with their flaws, replaced being kicked out of the group or attacked with actual written rights. Worldwide systems now let us respond to disasters that once would have quietly wiped out whole ancient communities without anyone ever finding out. This is the real shape of the story. Not a straight line from savage to civilized, and not a fall from a perfect past into modern misery, but a trade. We gained huge power over death, sickness, and distance. And in gaining that, many of us quietly lost the close-knit group, the flattened power structure, the carefully tended forest, the sleep gently guided by the setting sun. So what if ancient humans were more civilized than us? The honest answer is, in some ways, clearly, yes. They built fairness into everyday life instead of only writing it into laws we still struggle to follow. They carried the sick and disabled for decades instead of arguing over whether to pay for their care. They cared for forests instead of only putting out fires. Their nights ended in real rest, not endless scrolling, and in other ways, just as clearly, no. They buried more children than they raised. They lived, on average, half as long as we do. They had no medicine for an infection that could easily be treated today, no courts for an unfair accusation, no way to call for help when the danger was bigger than the group. Maybe the real discovery isn't that one time was better than the other. It's that civilization was never a straight staircase climbing steadily upward. It was a series of choices, made and unmade, gained and lost, by people just as capable of kindness, cleverness, and cruelty as we are today. Your ancestors built glue from tree bark and understood chemistry with no name for it. They carried the injured for 40 years without ever asking for thanks. They slept when the temperature told them to, and woke before the sun did. And somewhere in your own restless nights, your own quiet loneliness, your own body aching for movement, it rarely gets some part of that old rhythm is still in there, waiting, not asking you to go back, just asking you to remember that forward was never the only direction human life could move.